Do you guys want to start? You guys
Yeah, let's
ready?
do it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Whether you're on Zoom or Facebook Live, we thank you so much for taking the time out. I know this is a very complicated topic, but it's also very interesting. And we apologize for conflicting with the Golden Knights. Amanda promised that she was going to give any important updates, so you won't miss any critical details. But probably the most important update that I think is around is the fact that the commission, the K-12 Commission on School Funding, gave a recommendation to the legislators and the governor on a plan for funding our K-12 schools. So we're really excited about that. And we're joined by Guy Hobbs, who is the vice chair of the commission, and he's a tax policy expert. Hi, Guy. Oh, and by
Hi,
the
how
way,
are
my name
you?
is Michelle. Hello, I'm Michelle. I'm with Educate Nevada Now.
And I'm Amanda with Educate Nevada Now.
So Guy, can you tell us a little bit about your history with tax policy and finance here in Nevada?
Sure. I don't want to risk losing anybody to the Golden Knights game by going into too much detail, but I've worked in and around Nevada public finance since the early 1980s, which is a long time ago, and continue to work in that area today. A lot of that has been involved directly in legislation around several critical elements of tax policy in the state, from property tax to sales tax, consolidated tax, most of the other tax sources. Do a lot of consulting and major public infrastructure and public funding of major projects and programs. And so the opportunity to participate in the commission was an opportunity to apply some of that same background to the area of education, and I was very eager to do it.
Yeah, and we were really thrilled to see you on the commission because I think that's kind of been the missing link. There's been a lot of discussions throughout the past decade or so about, the need for additional funding, and we've just it's been a broken record. So it was really nice to see that coming together. Not only identifying the need, but identifying how to get there. And in talking about the commission, one of the roles of the commission was to determine what that need was, and you all did do that, correct? So you talked about restoring, funds that have been lost, and meeting, benchmarks that kind of get students where they need to be. So you have those targets as a commission. I think one of the easiest to understand is getting to the national average. So how can we kind of get to where the other states are, essentially, instead of being at the bottom? So can you tell us a little bit about what happened after that? So the process in, okay, you have the targets. What was kind of the first steps in discussing how you're going to actually reach those targets on the revenue side?
Well, maybe, Amanda, if you don't mind, a comment or two that led to those targets too, because, it's,
Mhm.
if you think back to SB 543, one of the things that it charged the commission with, in addition to much of the work that we did for the first, I don't know, 10 or 12 months of our meeting time, which was focused on the formulaic aspects of how to distribute the funding. 543 gave the commission the additional charge of identifying what it referred to in the bill as optimal funding. And I think after a few meetings, and obviously you all were participants in those meetings as well, you can talk about something as ethereal as optimal funding for months and months and months, because it's something that your viewpoint and Michelle's may be different than another group's or another group's as far as what constitutes optimal. So I suppose that in trying to evaluate this, I come from a quantitative background, and something that's ethereal is not as easy to quantify as people might think. And so I thought, well, let's default to a couple of proxy values in the meantime while we're continuing to have this discussion. And I would expect that we would continue to have the optimal funding discussion for several months, if not years to come. But we needed a couple of proxy values, and the national average certainly appeared to be a good starting point. And then I thought, well, there are people out there that would probably say, well, the average or median, or however you want to display central tendencies, that may not describe Nevada because we're so unique. And there may be some questioning as to whether or not the average is an appropriate number for us. So the second proxy value that I looked at was what was professional judgment in this case? And of course, as you all well know, APA, Augenblick, and their group have been involved with these kinds of studies and activities in Nevada for quite some time. And so if you look at their number, how does that then relate to the average? Does that bolster the argument for average? And we could have a lot of discussions about whether or not we should be striving to be average or something beyond average. I'm not speaking to that at this point. But the current level of funding is $9,250 per student per year. The national average is closer to $12,650. So we're that far away from the national average at this point. The APA number would suggest that we should be just above 14,300. So in my way of looking at it, that provides additional augmentation, if you will, for the national average number being probably the lower end of that threshold on a path to optimal funding. Again, needing to quantify it, I needed something to actually point to then be able to convert that into, okay, how much will that cost? And we were able to do that. And that may be one of the things that you also want to talk about, but I wanted to give you that additional background as to how we got there and why I think both of those numbers are important as we move toward what the bill says is optimal funding.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And, not to get too deep into those targets, but, APA has done several studies over the years, and they've done studies elsewhere in the country. They're kind of like a gold standard for, I guess one way to describe it is determining, what funding is necessary for students to meet state standards. So it's a very Nevada specific thing because they're talking to educators, they're talking to districts and saying, here's what's expected of students. What would it take for you to get there? What kind of staffing levels and things like that? So we were really happy to see that that was one of the benchmarks that the commission identified. And I think national average is really good because I think people understand it.
And they seem close enough too.
Yeah.
Where we shoot for one, we land in the other one, we're still in a so much better position than if we stay where we are now and don't make any movement.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, it's a strong indicator that where we are today isn't where we likely should be and need to be as we move forward. And again, that's why we used both of those values, because that target area is significantly above. I mean, just to get to the national average would be 37% more spending than is being done today. To get to the APA number, 55% more. Those are huge increases. And when you translate those, and I think it gets back to your first question, Amanda, when you translate those to dollars over a 10-year period, to get to the national average would require $2.2 billion more per year in spending than is being spent today, or an average of around $218 million each year over the next 10 years in new revenue to meet that target. Now, if you go to the APA number, that's closer to $3.2 billion in additional spending 10 years from now. And on an average basis, having to come up with $320 million over a 10-year period to hit that target. Either of those is a very large number. But we needed to identify that to then be able to say, okay, if those are the funding targets that get you to national average, and we took into consideration enrollment growth and inflation and all those other things that I won't go into here, but spreadsheet after spreadsheet, they're very exciting to look at, but it's really what you see on the bottom line that tells you what you need to know. So how do you go about generating revenue that would come close to that? And again, I don't want to get out in front of your questions, but one of the things that we worked through with the commission fairly early on is, there are certain principles of taxation, and you need to evaluate those nearly every time you're talking about new funding targets. Clearly, in this case, sufficiency of a revenue source is very high on the list. And I would think to most of us, for something as important as education, predictability and stability of being able to actually achieve those revenues would be right up at the top of the list. And of course, that's where the commission came down on this as well. So you use those as, I don't know, measures or markers for identifying funding sources to match up against the funding challenge that we've quantified here.
So if you could, in bullet points, I think it was stability. What were the ones that you guys landed on that you felt were important that allowed you to then start looking at funding sources?
Well, clearly there are about 12 of these
Yeah.
attributes of tax policy, sometimes more or less, but sufficiency was number one. You need a sufficient enough revenue source to actually fund this, right? And so when you consider a lot of the revenue sources that are out there, a lot of them don't come close to producing $200 million each year for the next 10 years. That's, you know, it's a fairly heavy lift. So that narrows your focus down to those that would have the capacity to do that. Stability and predictability were number two. And again, you know, from a planning perspective, you would like to know that the revenue source that you're relying on to fund your most critical programs is actually going to materialize from year to year. Now, we may have little bumps because of the economy from time to time, but you certainly wouldn't want to pick a volatile revenue source and tie that to something as important as education. And that's where the discussion about industry-specific taxes sort of came into the mix as well. Some of the industry-specific taxes are popular targets, whether that's gaming or mining or certain other business groupings, modified business tax, and other things that you know fit into that same category. And then you would ask yourself, do those meet the measure of predictability and stability over time? You look back at history, and you know, mining is like a roller coaster. It's based on commodity prices of what they're mining. There are years that it's doing great. It's doing very well right now. There are years that it didn't do so well and mines are closing. You know, we have to be cognizant of that. The gaming industry, hospitality industry, entertainment sectors, how have they done over the last year or so? You know, and we started really learning during the Great Recession that those were not as recession proof as people previously thought. So, you know, our view of that was those certainly should be looked at, but maybe more as a complementary or supplementary source of funding for an overall portfolio of funding than strictly relying on things that we know are subject to volatility.
Yeah. They're not going to be the game changer that some people think they would be.
Especially on the sufficiency.
Well, in the near term, you might be able to extract. I know that mining has come to the table, and there's some discussions going on right now with respect to that. And if something like that were to help you jumpstart toward the 10-year funding plan, I would say that absolutely, that makes sense. But to rely on that each year for the next 10 years the same way is probably not good fiscal policy if you think the predictability and stability are important parameters to use for a funding source.
Yeah, and we've really struggled on educating folks on the sufficiency side. I think that's one of our big things because, I mean, with marijuana and mining, I mean, we're all for any dime we can get, you know, towards education is wonderful. But, you know, we often hear like, well, why do we need to talk about more funding? Don't we have marijuana money? And it's like, well, you know, that's like a drop in the bucket of the actual need. So I think it was, you know, it's really important that sufficiency piece is put out there. Along with the other things, predictability and stability. So let's talk about some of the actual proposals. So I guess we could start with property tax. What are some of the changes to the property tax structure that you recommended?
Well, you know, it's hard to say whether or not, I guess they are in the form of recommendations because property tax is currently one of the principal funding sources for education. There's an operating rate of 75 cents. I don't mean to get into the weeds on property tax because we'll drive people to the Golden Knights game right away, right? But education is heavily reliant on property tax for both operating schools and funding the capital improvement of schools. So it's already part of the funding regimen for education. And so I wanted to take a look at that to see if there is any additional capacity within property tax. And capacity doesn't always mean raising people's tax rates. The way that we assess property in the state of Nevada is rather archaic, to say the least. We are the only state in the United States that depreciates the value of improvements to real property. That's something we can proudly say we're the only ones that do it. Now, from a economic and logical standpoint, it's a very difficult thing to defend. I think when it was originally put into place, the thinking was that it would over time reward people who stay in their home for 30 years. Not that many people do that. That's just not reality today. But the single biggest issue out there is something referred to as abatements. There's several years ago, and I'm trying to think of a way to explain this that's accurate but not boring. Several years ago, it was actually the Assessors Association that was concerned in advance of the Great Recession that property values were spiking, and they would be the ones, nobody likes to put assessor under their name, right? Everybody has a negative connotation that they attach to being the tax assessor. And they were concerned about rising valuations causing spikes in people's property tax rates and proposed the abatements. The abatements constrain the growth of a property tax bill from year to year by certain percentages. In reality, those percentages are much lower than were originally thought. And I can tell you today, to try to make a long story as short as I possibly can, the amount of abatement out there is in excess of $1 billion. Now, what that means is those are taxes that are assessed but not billed. So there's something wrong with the system if you're assessing at one level and billing at another. The folks who are a little bit more conservative with regard to tax would argue, well, that's a way to stop the growth of property tax. True, it is, but it also has an effect on the opposite side in terms of funding the programs that it's intended to fund. That 75-cent tax rate that is already on the books in Nevada to fund education doesn't produce 75 cents worth of tax because of the abatements. So actually, since it was imposed years ago, it's actually declined in value while the cost of education has gone higher. You can't do anything with property tax without doing something with the abatements. And Amanda, one of the recommendations was at very least, cap the abatements and don't let them accrue any further. The next step ramping that up would be to phase them out over time. The next step would be to eliminate them at the end of a phase out period. Then we pointed to looking at the overall tax system. Are there some things that need to be modernized? Should we have the depreciation factor, which reduces the valuation of property below market value? And again, we're the only state that finds logic in that. The way we assess property, whether people realize it or not, you're not assessed based on the market value of your home. You're assessed on the value of the land plus the replacement cost of the structure on the land, less depreciation, down to a 25% valuation on the improvements. And that has nothing to do with market. So shifting over to more of a market-based system over time, which could also be phased in, would stop some of this bleeding that's going on because of the abatements. We too often, when we talk about taxes, whether it's property tax or sales tax, tend to talk about rate and not base. And that's really what we're talking about here with property tax. How is the base put together? We're not really talking about the rate. And on the sales tax side, and I know you haven't gotten to that one yet, but it's the same thing. People rightly say that our sales tax rate has gotten higher. It's 8.35% here in Clark County. But how does that truly compare to a similar rate in, say, California? It doesn't. And the reason that it doesn't is because we only apply it to a certain very narrow list of items. Here in Nevada, we only apply sales tax to tangible goods that are sold at retail. And those are really important words because if something is not a tangible good, it's not assessed with a sales tax. Over 60% of our economy is in services, not in tangible goods. 40 years ago, it was the opposite. So we're shifting to more of a service-based economy away from tangible goods. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier before the webinar started. There was a bill in the session this time to look at digital downloads. And that's a very good example of one that didn't really exist 20 years ago. And it's very much a part of the economy today. And it's just generally discretionary, right? So anytime you can attach the word discretionary to it, you basically reduce any argument of regressivity. It's those things that are non-discretionary that you would tax that really poke at the regressivity argument. So, that on the sales tax side, a reevaluation of the base. And we have, aside from those things that are just not tangible items, we have a laundry list of things that over the years, whether by voter referendum or legislative act, are specifically exempted from sales tax that are tangible goods. And some of them you wouldn't want to see changed, things like pharmaceuticals, groceries purchased at the grocery store, things like that, because those would fit into the regressive category. But I can guarantee you, I've looked over that list a number of times over the years, and there are some that arguably need to be reviewed for current sensibility. And in addition to that, you have this whole category, again, roughly 2/3 of our economy that is untouched by the sales tax that is discretionary, right? So there's a lot of capacity on the sales tax side. And look, I'm a very conservative person when it comes to this stuff. I see the realities in the numbers. I'm definitely not pro-tax, but the charge here is to find ways that something could be funded that is, according to all the data that we've seen and talked about during this sit down, would suggest that we're underfunding a critical element of public service, education. So how would you go about funding it? Those are the two primary ways where those of us that work in this area believe there's sufficient capacity. It meets the sufficiency test. Property tax certainly meets the predictability and stability test. Sales tax less so. But by broadening the sales tax base, you also reduce the volatility because you're relying on a broader expanse of goods than you're currently relying on. 20% of the sales tax that's generated in Clark County comes from eating and drinking establishments. So if you have something like a pandemic, guess what? Eating and drinking establishments are closed, right? And not that you're going to have a recurrence of a pandemic. We don't know what will occur. It could be a number of different things that cause economic volatility, but it has all of the signs that would tell us that broadening the base would reduce the volatility and therefore make it more predictable. And then the third argument, and I'm sorry if I'm stepping on any of your questions, but
Okay.
you kind of got me on a roll.
We're covering it all. So.
You're on a roll.
The third principle that the commission identified as being hugely important is that of equity, right? And equity is either horizontal or vertical, and I won't get into all of that, but it's sort of between and among different levels of people who pay taxes. And one of the things I would say about sales tax and property tax is it cuts across a very broad swath, whether you're talking about residential, commercial, industrial, it cuts across a very broad swath. Businesses also pay sales tax. They purchase goods. It cuts across a very broad swath. So in terms of meeting all of those tests, both of them do. I would be also the first to say, because this isn't my first time around talking about systemic problems with the assessment system or the sales tax system, which by the way gets narrower every couple of years when something is put on the ballot and people vote yes to additionally exempt that. The base gets narrower and narrower and narrower. I've been around this a few times, and I realize how popular it is to raise the words property tax and sales tax to elected officials. I fully understand that. However, if you look at it from the other side, we have a funding challenge here that we need to meet. Please tell me where else you could look. Unless you get very innovative, or I don't know what word to use, because one of the other things that occurs to me is there's a lot of arguments made about Nevada's property tax compared to other states. And by the way, where I would put us in an overall burden ranking is at about 35th out of the 51, 52 states and territories that report. So we're certainly not on the upper half of tax burden on the property tax side. Do we want to move up there just because we're low? Heck no. But we have a pretty good reason to talk about it here. On the sales tax side, when you combine our tax rate with the areas of trade over which it's applied, we're not at the higher end of that either. Our rate looks like it, but given the narrowness of the things that it's applied to, not really. Again, going back to the capacity argument. But again, I realize that, this is a very sensitive topic that we're getting into with elected officials. Any new taxes are very difficult, have very difficult prospects in that type of environment. But on the other side of it, the downside of doing nothing is also something that can be measured, and nobody knows that more than you guys.
Yeah.
So speaking of doing nothing, if I had to summarize the property taxes in the most simplest layman's term for the general person to understand, is reassessing the value so that it's accurate or more accurate, ending what the abatements, which are kind of like tax breaks kind of that were given over the years as a response to challenging times, and just kind of lifting that slowly. I think I saw somewhere that there's been that in just the last biennium, schools lost $840 million in just 2 years from the abatements, is something that I saw. So over the years, it's probably been billions, right?
Well, again, today it's 1.05 billion, but the number is growing
Just today.
Every year. And we talked earlier about the funding target being 2.2 billion 10 years from now. You have $1 billion. If the Abatement Act had never gone into place, there would be $1 billion more today to apply to services, including education. Absolutely.
In 1 year.
And that would recur from year to year, right?
Yes, and the sales tax, kind of how I understand it, it's not an increase in the rate, but it's an increase in, or a kind of modernizing the taxes so that we're taxing things that have changed, right? Like we now download movies. We used to rent a movie and pay a tax on that, so now we download it and we're not paying a tax on that, for example. Or now we've switched. I saw somewhere a report that more than half of the commerce is now sales service based, right? And we're not taxing that either. So it's just adjusting as the times have adjusted, adjusting the tax for that, and making sure that it's not regressive, that we're not taxing things that are important, like you mentioned, pharmaceuticals or food or things that people basically need to survive. So ensuring that it's not regressive. But you did touch on something else. We've been, getting a lot of questions from people saying things like, oh, well, what about, the lottery, or what about a state income tax? I did notice that a lot of the recommendations were not necessarily new taxes. They were just adjusting the taxes. Can you talk a little bit about why, about other things that maybe passed through your mind or didn't, and why that's the case? Because that's a question we get a lot. I'm sorry. Oh,
no, I fully understand it. And I would encourage everybody to keep those ideas coming in, a lottery has been something that's popped up, like every 4 years, like the Olympics, a lottery seems to pop up. And from a sufficiency standpoint, I don't think that would get us there. There obviously has been a great deal of reluctance on the part of the gaming industry to support something like a lottery here, which I know to a lot of people sounds nonsensical. But that's been the reality over the past few decades. I don't think it would be a panacea. Again, it might be a complementary piece of an overall puzzle. People also raise social arguments about things like a lottery, which I'm always amazed about. We hear it about sales tax being regressive. Well, not all sales tax is. If it's less regressive, if it's on discretionary it's more regressive if it's on discretionary purchases, less regressive if it's on discretionary purchases, Non-discretionary purchases are things that people have to have, and those are the things that we're more reluctant to ever put a tax on. But the things that are done by choice, like you mentioned, downloading videos and things like that, those are very discretionary and far less regressive. I never hear the other side of the lottery argument where there's a social side of it too. I think, and I've read a lot of things about lotteries being rather regressive, because who plays lotteries? Not millionaires, right? So, you know, all of these have both financial and social arguments to make.
Yeah, that
And
makes
so
sense.
you're a, oh, go ahead, Amanda.
Oh, I was just going to explore the regressivity. Could you explain kind of in layman's terms for folks that might not be aware of that argument? Because that's, you know, that's a huge issue. A lot of folks that are pushing for new or expanded taxes are very sensitive about about regressivity. Can you explain a little bit about what that means?
If I had a whiteboard, I could do a heck of a chart, Amanda, but I don't, so I'll try. Regressivity essentially would, in the simplest of terms, those with lower incomes are more highly impacted by the tax, right? Those with higher incomes are less impacted by the tax. That would be, you know, a simple way to, it'd probably get you maybe a B- or a C+ on an econ exam, but that's pretty close to being what it is. If it disproportionately impacts those with lower incomes, it's determined to be regressive. And a sales tax on something like food, which everybody needs, would disproportionately impact those with lower incomes because they spend a higher percentage of their overall income buying food. Same thing with something like pharmaceuticals. So we try to be cognizant of that when we structure these to reduce regressivity by removing those items that would have that type of impact on those that could least afford to pay it.
Yeah. Because
and as a business,
that makes sense.
Oh, go ahead, Amanda. Yeah.
I was going to say, because immediately when the recommendations came out, there were some lawmakers that were like, oh, once they heard those words sales tax, or immediately like, oh, no, we can't do that. That's regressive. So I think it's important for folks to know that this, I mean, in essence, what I'm hearing is that it actually kind of makes the existing sales tax less regressive because you're broadening the base and you're focusing on things that are discretionary. You're focusing on services that are typically discretionary, and you can obviously exempt things that are necessary. So it's kind of interesting. It seems like a way to broaden the base without actually kind of making it a little bit, you know, sharing the burden on things that are not necessities in life, essentially.
Yeah, and as somebody who watched
the
presentation, we heard the commission discuss that a lot, making sure that it's not regressive and taking into consideration, you know, the impact that it's going to have on people. So I do remember that being a big part of the discussion from the commission members, and it's all over the report as well. There's just making sure that's a big consideration and is part of this.
You know, Michelle and Amanda, one of the other things I'd remind everybody of, when you look at things like, you know, sales tax, comparative sales tax burdens, I guess you could Google something like this, comparative sales tax burden state to state or comparative property tax burden state to state. Again, on the property tax side, I know we're in about the 35th to 38th, you know, on the good end, right? We have a lower proportionate burden than other states do. On the sales tax side, I know we're on the lower half of that as well. But one of the things you have to consider when you're making these comparisons to other states is a lot of these other states that have the higher property tax burdens and higher sales tax burdens also have a state income tax on top of it. This is a state that does not have income tax, yet we rank lower on the property tax spectrum than states that actually have an income tax that are feeding the public revenue side of it. That is extraordinarily important to understand. It's really the same concept as looking at the sales tax versus the sales tax base. When people hear sales tax, they immediately think of the rate. I'm talking about the base, not necessarily the rate. In fact, you could probably broaden the base and lower the rate and still generate more dollars. We can let people, you know, think about that one overnight. And the same thing with property tax. We could get rid of the abatements and actually lower the rate and produce the same amount of money. And if you did something like that, and this is one of the more complex recommendations that was in the report, if you did something like that, remove the abatement, lowered the tax rate so it was tax neutral for everybody, you would clear a lot of headspace under the allowed tax rate that can be charged according to or levied according to state statute. And that could be applied to education going forward. So there's a number of different ways to mechanically make these adjustments. But the first reaction is always to, oh my gosh, somebody's raising my rate. No, it doesn't have to be that way. It's the base that's problematic, not the rates.
Great. And I'll ask one more question before I take questions from the audience. But you're a tax policy expert. A lot of people go to you for investment ideas and things that are happening to grow our economy. What have you seen as far as the correlation of our K-12 system and companies wanting to come here and invest in Nevada?
Well, there are a couple things. And by the way, there's nothing better in life than to be known as a tax policy expert.
I'm sorry.
It's one of those things. What do you do? When companies are looking to possibly relocate to Nevada, they're going to be looking at a number of things. As you guys are well aware on the education side, having an educated workforce is going to be right up there. They need to staff up. And particularly if you're looking at technical areas, having a educated workforce that they can access is very high on the list. Also on the list would be, the affordability of doing business here. The cost of land, the cost of construction, all those kinds of things always come into the mix. So do taxes, right? We've been pretty lucky to attract, over the last 10 to 15 years, some higher level businesses into the state because we do have an attractive business tax climate. Regardless of what some people may write, we do rank very well in that area. So it isn't our tax policy that keeps people away. I can tell you they're running away from some states largely because of tax policy. And Nevada, by comparison, again, with the no income tax, the Golden Knights and the Raiders and folks like that have realized that, maybe that'll be a good thing in terms of signing this really important free agent, because one of the things we can tell them is, they don't have a state income tax to pay on top of it. But our tax policy has actually been an attractive feature of attracting business. I think one of the bigger impediments is the depth of the workforce, which education has a direct correlation to.
It seems like there really needs to be a balance in that movement towards, adequately funding schools. And I think this kind of goes to the point of not really honing in on a bunch of industry specific taxes, but really kind of having a broad change that can really share the burden amongst the population that's going to benefit.
Well, to put that simply too, I think when your listeners and others that you talk to, when they put together an investment portfolio, they probably don't stick 100% of it in one stock, right? You try to balance that out, fixed income and equities and this and that to try to make sure over time you're meeting your objectives. And the same thing is true in the construction of a revenue portfolio. You want to construct it with the same things in mind.
So I'm going to go ahead and start taking some questions. We have a question from Tyler. He wanted to know what has been done to change property tax rules related to depreciation of improvements and abatements.
Nothing yet, which is one of the things that, did I get lost?
No, you're there. We hear you.
Okay. Nothing has happened yet, and it's one of the things that we suggested be evaluated as a part of the overall modernization of property tax. So we're with you, Tyler. We agree that should be evaluated.
And it seems like there have been bills. I know last session they, I believe, tried to address depreciation. So it seems like they're kind of all, there's always people trying to claw away at it. But like you said, it's I think the public really needs to understand, legislators and lawmakers really need kind of help from the general public in, supporting a big change like that. And I think that's why it's kind of scary. Like you mentioned these two things, sales tax and property tax. And, a lot of folks don't understand it. They just they think the rates are going up. They think it's going to be, catastrophic for their family. And so I think a big part of that is getting folks to understand maybe even and I don't know if you all are planning on doing any work like this, but kind of evaluating what is the likely impact on a household with these types of changes. Has there been any work in the past to kind of help folks understand how this will impact them financially?
Yeah, that's something that absolutely needs to be done. It needs to be taken from these gross macro numbers of billions of dollars down to individual impacts for businesses and residents and everybody else. So yes, that would be something that we would be looking to do. That's a pretty simple thing to do with property tax. We know what the median price of a home is, and we could certainly, using that as an illustration, indicate what kind of effect these changes might have if you were to do some of these recommendations. And the same on the sales tax side. We generally have a pretty good understanding of how the average household apportions and spends its money. And so we could probably produce estimates there.
And would this be a constitutional amendment, or is it a county by county action to change these rules? Is the follow-up.
Wow, Michelle, that's a really, really good question, because when you're talking about funding education, and given you mentioned the Constitution, which speaks to equity in education, you couldn't do it county by county, I don't think, and defend the equity part of it. So you would have to do this on a statewide basis, and all of the counties would have to be dealt with similarly.
That makes sense. So I know there was a lot of urgency to make sure we get the commission gets this out before the end of session, which we did. Have you had any conversations with leadership about this? That's one of our questions that we're getting. Have they talked to you, reached out to you?
Well, first of all, I'm just one member of the commission, and I've had a couple of calls about it, but not from legislative leadership or any other elected officials. I realize, in fairness, that this report came out fairly late in this legislative session, and consequently, there wasn't an expectation that it would likely be dealt with during this session. And in the report, you'll see that we actually modeled this two ways: one, a 10-year implementation, and one, an 8-year implementation. And it was done for that very reason, that we recognized that this was coming out fairly late in the session. Still, in the back of my mind, I thought, well, it's important to get this in front of them as they're dealing with the old Nevada plan migrating into the pupil-centered funding plan, and maybe have the next year and a half to think about it, to study it, to research it, possibly convene some hearings or meetings to take it a bit further and develop some of these concepts. The commission will obviously continue to do that over the next, between now and the next legislative session as well.
Great. And another question that we got is, what do you think it will take to convince our legislators and the general public that this is a critical need?
That
a big one.
Yeah, I mean, that gets away from how to fund it, and it gets more toward the side of explaining why you should, right? And that's where, and I've watched this over the years. You bring up something like sales tax or property tax, and people have a visceral reaction to it. No, that's not good. You're raising my taxes. I hate that. You have to always make sure that you're talking about. I think I referred to it earlier as the cost of inaction. And the cost of inaction in this case would essentially be to say that, okay, the $9,250 that we're spending today is adequate. When we know that the national average is 37% higher and the APA standard is 55% higher than that. I think it has to be couched that way, that to say no to the funding side of it is the same as saying that what we're currently doing is adequate for the students here in Nevada. I think there are a lot of you that don't believe that the answer to that is yes, or it makes any sense that you could defend the current level of funding as adequate given where it stacks up against the professional judgment and the national averages. So I think you have to talk about both sides of it. You can't just simply have a property tax or sales tax debate without first establishing the criticality of the need to apply more funds to education and achieve the goals of the state as a whole.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to remind folks that we're not talking about just dollars here. We're talking about resources. Right now we have the largest class sizes in the country. We have trouble staffing, counselors and social workers, and, we don't have one-to-one technology. So, I mean, these things translate into real resources for students. And I think if you ask most folks out there, having 45 kids in your class for one teacher is just unacceptable and makes it difficult for those students to learn. So we're always trying to remind folks, because sometimes we're just throwing more money at the problem, and it's, first off, we haven't done that yet. I'd love to see what that looks like. But second, I mean, we're actually throwing resources at students that really need it, really critical resources that other states have, and we've really done without for a long time.
And that's what's great about the APA report is that it says this is a ratio that should exist from teachers to students. This is how many social workers you should have. And so it's not just an amount that came out of the blue, it's actually what they think is required in actual resources. And that's how much it costs. So we know that. And then another great piece about it, about the bill is, or the PCFP, is that it comes with an accountability measure. Amanda, I think you're somewhat familiar, more familiar with the accountability piece of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of eliminating this idea that there's a black hole. There's a lot of reporting on the actual resources that are purchased at the district and the school level, which will be made available to the public, which is something that's kind of been foggy before. Some districts are able to do it, some haven't. Now it's something that is required. There's also, and this may go away during this session, but there's a requirement that the Department of Ed actually kind of detail what resources could realistically be purchased with the funding given. So the class size ratios, things like that. I don't know if that's going to stick. It's actually a very difficult thing for them to do without a lot of additional staffing. So I don't know if that's going to stay around for now. It might be something that comes down the road, but I do believe there's a lot more accountability to avoid that kind of, oh, we're throwing money at it, we don't know where it's going. I feel like the bill has done a lot for transparency.
Well, Amanda, I'll just add something to that. Having a 10-year phase into the funding target, I thought a lot of people's reaction to that would be, you're seriously going to take 10 years to solve this problem? And people may have that reaction to it. But the other way of looking at that is it also gives you 5 legislative sessions during which to evaluate the increased investment and determine a lot of the things that you're referring to, right? Look at it again 2 years from now after making the initial 2-year investment. How far along are we in achieving some of those goals? I mean, there needs to be a constant monitoring and reevaluation of not only the money that's spent and whatever successes might come out of that, but what the long-term funding targets really are. APA probably needs to update their report every 2 years along the way. But having a 10-year phase-in like that gives you that opportunity to reassess, reevaluate, and re-engineer the funding strategy.
And guys, this has been quite a bit of work. Amanda and I, we watch every single one of these meetings as it is. They're long, they're a lot of work. And we know behind the scenes, you've been doing a lot of work. I mean, just putting this report together and the recommendations. I mean, it was a sea of spreadsheets. So why did you agree to be part of this commission? What drove you to say, like, hey, this is something that I'm willing to do, knowing it was going to be a lot of work?
I have a lot of snappy one-liners I could give back to you, but the true reason is that this is obviously volunteer work. This isn't paying work, and that is not something that, because of the understanding of how important this is to the future of the state. All those things that we talked about earlier, if we're truly going to grow the economy, the workforce has to grow in such a way that we're more attractive. That leads to our ability to diversify and reduce some of the reliance on single industry and all those economic things I could go on for hours and hours about. But it's also our kids, right? I mean, I'm involved with kids on a completely different front. I'm the president of youth soccer in the state of Nevada. And I think that their growth, both on the academic side and the athletic side, creating more opportunities for families to do things together. I mean, I think all of those things are absolutely critical. It's funny, I've spent a lot of time in the early part of my career going back to New York in the financial markets when we were selling debt and getting ratings for the state of Nevada. And it was unbelievable to me, the impression that people in New York and the financial markets had of Nevada and Las Vegas. It's absolutely what none of us want them to have an impression of. We're not all dealers and dancers, right? We're actually growing a community here and trying to make appropriate investments and making it a better and stronger community. And I don't think there's any place where you achieve more for every dollar invested than in our kids and through education. And that's largely why I was a part of this commission.
Well, we're really grateful that you agreed to be part of the commission and that you agreed to take the time to talk with us and explain some of this. We know it's really detailed, but there was a lot of misconceptions, a lot of people not understanding. We had questions ourselves, so we are so lucky and grateful that we got to have Guy Hobbs, the vice chair tax policy expert.
Oh, wow, yeah. No, look, I'm happy to do this
us.
again. Anytime any of your folks want to talk, get into the weeds, I'm happy to talk to them. Amanda, I certainly can be reached through you guys, and I'm always happy to do this because there will be more misconceptions as we move through this. We're talking about, a lot of money, and we're talking about taxes and, things that just don't go that easily, right? So I would expect that we'll need to have a number of these conversations and sort of rally everybody over to the viewpoint that the commission tried to present to the legislature and the elected officials.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. And we're going to take you up on that.
Sure.
We'll have more of Guy. We'll make sure not to do it during a Golden Knights game. Promise. Not next time.
By the way, what's the score, Amanda?
It was 4-0 a few minutes ago, so we're good. Real good.
Nice.
All right, everybody,
Nice.
Breathe easy. Good news. Guy and Golden Knights all in one night. This is great. Thank you all. Thanks, Guy.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.